As you might have noticed, the last couple of years have been militarily eventful. And as flashpoints around the world have seen nations turn to kinetic methods of dispute resolution, perhaps unsurprisingly, demand for military equipment and munitions has grown. For the many countries that can't produce all of their own equipment, but also can't risk going without it, that's often raised a critical geopolitical question. Who do you buy from? And with formerly dominant supplier Russia continuing to retreat from the international market in recent years, there's been plenty of scope for disruption and a couple of new alliances. And so today, with the release of new SIPRI data covering arms exports through 2025, we have a chance to dig into how the international rearmament race is actually playing out. From who's buying and how demand is changing, to who's winning, losing, or just treading water in the export race to try and build influence and scale. So to allow us to try and unpack all that properly, I'm going to be splitting this into 2 episodes. Today, we're going to be looking back at 2025, what changed with defence spending around the world, what some of the major trends were, and which countries won, lost, or were somewhere in the middle in the competition to try and make sure that in an increasingly dangerous world, other countries were looking to their defence industry in the race to get strapped as rapidly as possible. Then next week, after a hopefully short and successful surgery on my part, we're going to start looking forward. What systems are likely to be in demand? Where is that demand coming from? And some of the major multi-billion-dollar make-or-break competitions, from 6th-generation fighters to air defence systems, that might be exactly that for some of the national companies involved. Before we start unpacking the arms trade in 2025, though, let me welcome back a returning sponsor. There have been times where keeping up with the news might be difficult, and then there's 2026, where 2 wars can kick off in a week, and the information space could generously be described as complicated. That can put a premium on tools that might help you get across events quickly, while also not missing as many key points. This headline, for example, says the United States is potentially planning to insure and escort oil tankers through the Straits of Hormuz. But other headlines might bring in more of the context and the why, such as surging oil and gas prices linked to shipping threats, and the broader events of the war in the Middle East. The tool being used here is Ground News. It reportedly draws on thousands of news sources around the world to enable you not just to flick between headlines, but click through to the full story when you want the detail. It can also sometimes help add context to what you might be reading, with things like ownership information standing out as potentially interesting examples. Then there are tools to help you customize or broaden your experience. You can, for example, hone in on particular topics, but another one I've long found interesting in an era of online echo chambers is the blind spot feed. This can help surface stories mostly being covered by sources you might not ordinarily consume, and it can potentially help give you a little bit of insight into what other parts of the internet at any given time might be seeing. That may not be a silver bullet for the echo chamber problem, but I'm not sure anything is. And so if you're looking for an extra tool in your information toolkit, this might be it. If that's the case, the link in the description will give you access to a 40% discount on Ground News Vantage plan, which is the one I use, that gives you access to that full suite of features. And so with my thanks to Ground News as always, let's get back to it. Okay, so let's start with some of the context behind some of the movements we're going to talk about today. I'm not sure if you noticed, but geopolitically, 2025 was a calm and peaceful year, compared to 2026. Compared to many other recent years, though, it was an absolute shit show. And when you're talking about arms transfers and defence spending, that kind of context is king to driving the demand side of the equation. If you have an environment where the threat profile in many global neighbourhoods, so to speak, shifts more from the safe to leave your door open at night to the own a tank for home defence end of the spectrum, then more often than not, you're going to see that flow through to spending, which is exactly what we've seen. In some cases, responding to conflicts that are already happening, and in other cases, apprehended ones, which, given the way the first quarter of 2026 has played out, in some cases might not have been a bad call. To put a number to it, the global uptick in defence spending in 2025 was only about 2.5% in real terms. That might seem more subdued, but mostly because it's wedged between a significant increase of between 7 and 8% that we saw in 2024, and some jumps we can probably expect to see in 2026. The increase that was there was also deeply uneven. Spending by the MENA, so Middle East, North Africa nations, grew by about 4.5% in 2025, compared to 10% in 2024, reaching a total of about $220 billion per annum. But almost 70% of that increase was accounted for by only 2 countries. Israel, which is currently fighting a war, and Algeria, which isn't fighting a war but spends like it is. When we pivot next episode to looking at 2026 though, I think it's fair to expect that, given recent events, we might be expecting to see some upward revisions, especially from the GCC countries, while the Iranian military budget is probably just going to be set to yes until further notice. In Asia, we saw continuing increases in a lot of countries, but overall, as you can see on the chart, a long-running regional trend continued, which is the gap between estimated Chinese defence spending and everyone else in the region is steadily narrowing, meaning if nothing else changes, we would eventually expect Chinese spending to first reach and then overtake the rest of the regional countries combined. What you'll see in terms of arms transfer impacts, though, is a lot of that spending increase didn't translate into additional import demand, because a lot of it is coming from countries that produce the lion's share of their own equipment and are attempting to produce even more of it. Beijing, once one of the largest importers of Soviet and later Russian arms, is now in a position of the apprentice having overtaken the master in most respects. In a lot of platform categories, the latest Chinese offerings are just better than the Russian ones, and as we'll see a bit later on, that's translated into a lot of additional spending at the same time that imports have actually crashed. Similarly, big spending plans by the likes of Japan and the Republic of Korea have often focused on local or at least locally produced licensed designs. And especially in the case of Korea, as we'll see, it's also corresponded with the country shifting from primarily an arms importer to being one of the most successful and fastest growing exporters. While those two regions were significant globally, a lion's share of the new spending came in Europe. Spending growth by both Russia and Ukraine moderated. But, in the context of numerous security scares covering different cardinal directions, the very slow-moving train of European rearmament picked up a degree of urgency. In 2025, European countries allocated a record $563 billion equivalent to defence, with the largest single driver of that being Germany, which has now roughly doubled defence spending in nominal terms since 2020. Germany will get its own deep dive in the future, but for now, there's a couple of things to note about that surge in spending. Firstly, in an example of deep historical irony, it comes against a backdrop of Germany announcing intention to build what it describes as the strongest conventional military in Europe, and that ambition being generally welcomed by most of Germany's neighbours. So, congratulations, Moscow, you managed to get Warsaw and Paris cheering for German rearmament. The second thing to note is not a huge amount of that spending has actually converted into new capability yet. A lot of it is for procurements and investments that are going to take a long time to pay off. Orders for new equipment or supporting the creation of new infrastructure that might take years to be delivered and become operational. But the amount of stuff being shoved in the proverbial pipeline is growing and growing quickly. Another major driver of spending increase can be found in the Nordic countries. As with Germany, Denmark, Finland, Norway and Sweden have roughly doubled their spending from 2020 levels, reaching a combined total of about $54 billion equivalent in 2025. And the kicker here, in terms of the longer-term impact we should expect to see from a lot of that, is that many militaries seem focused on actually using a chunk of this new funding for rearmament. One way to measure this is the percentage of spending that countries have been directing towards equipment and procurement out of their overall defence budget. Because as convenient as it might be for commentators to be able to reuse essentially the same articles about everyone being short on ammunition and equipment time after time, conflict after conflict, if the goal is to be able to deter and, if necessary, win, this category is where we'd expect a lot of the necessary investment to show up. For a lot of critical arms buyers, especially in Asia or the Middle East and North Africa, we don't have that kind of detailed breakdown. But for most of Europe, courtesy of NATO data disclosures, we do. What it generally shows mostly across the board is the percentage of spending on equipment has been increasing. The chart on the right there compares figures for a couple of example states from 2016, 2021, 2024, and for some countries, we don't have data for countries like Germany or Denmark yet, 2025 as well. As you can see, a lot of the countries we're looking at have dialed things up. Germany to north of 20%, Denmark 30%, the UK around 35%, Finland 45%, and in Poland in 2025, this measure of the procurement budget was bigger than all of the rest of the budget put together. Then you have to combine that increase in equipment spending percentage with the increase in the budget overall. Here you can see the ramp up in spending by those same selected countries, again 2025 omitted in this case for Germany, but expect it to potentially break that y-axis near the top of the chart, and you can see what I'm getting at here. If, for example, you're Poland and you quadruple defence spending over the course of less than a decade, while also more than doubling the percentage of that spending that goes towards new equipment, the impact on your new stuff budget is the product of those two increases. Germany's equipment spend roughly quadrupled between 2016 and 2024. Poland's roughly tripled between 2021 and 2024, and almost doubled again the following year. Taken together, these NATO figures, plus some very back-of-the-envelope calculations, suggest that in 2025, the non-US members of NATO spent very roughly $190 billion on the equipment category, which, to put that in perspective, is about as much as Russia is believed to have spent on the military overall in 2025. But, in the context of an episode focusing on arms transfers, it's important to highlight a very important disconnect between defence spending and arms transfers. Emergencies and exceptions aside, there's usually a massive time delay. There can be an enormous delay between a government signing contracts and starting to put money on the table and a platform or a munition being delivered. And so for the most part, 2025 in terms of arms transfers isn't interesting because it provides a reflection of 2025's budgets. It's interesting because in some respects, it's more the shadow of 2022. A lot of these transfers reflect the rapid orders and particular geopolitical environment after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, more than they do, for example, the world after the changeover in US administration, which is another reason I'd suggest to split this topic into 2 episodes. To illustrate what I mean, let me show you a couple of charts. In 2025, Poland was one of the world's largest arms recipients, bringing in about 2,200 TIV worth of stuff. Keep in mind that from this point on, I'm almost always going to be using SIPRI TIV, trend indicator value, instead of US dollar amounts, because we're now mostly talking about SIPRI arms tracking, not national defence budgets. That approach has a couple of potential advantages. It's meant to cancel out factors like inflation, for example, but it can also fall short in a couple of cases. If a nation like North Korea releases absolutely no data on their weapon systems, TIV valuation can get a bit wonky. Similarly, the system is obviously only capable of tracking and valuing transfers that are eventually discovered. Meaning, again, if you're dealing with a famously transparent arms supplier like North Korea, you might not be getting the entire picture. But, at an aggregate level, it's enough to identify some major trends. What this chart shows you is when those 2025 deliveries in terms of value were actually originally ordered. And as you can see, the overwhelming majority of it really only falls into 2 categories. An F-35 order dating back to 2020, and then deliveries reflecting that oh shit moment in 2022, when Poland saw Ukraine being invaded and essentially went to the US and Korean arms markets and basically said, I'll take it. The largest single delivery in terms of value were M1A2 SEP V3 Abrams from the United States, followed by K2 Black Panthers, K9 Thunder self-propelled guns, and K239 MRLs from the Republic of Korea, a copious supply of ammunition for the above, along with the aforementioned F-35s and some Apaches. If we look at another major buyer, Saudi Arabia, the orders actually stretch even further back. Riyadh was one of the largest global recipients in 2025, but largely of systems they'd ordered in 2018 or even 2011. Just to give a little extra context, the 2011 figure is mostly for the kingdom's F-15 fleet, but that giant 2018 column, that's an interesting one. What that is, overwhelmingly, is the delivery of Saudi Arabia's terminal high-altitude air defense systems from the United States and a bunch of Talon interceptors to fire from them. The Saudis received 1,400 TIV worth of THAAD, 550 TIV worth of THAAD interceptors, as well as PAC-2 interceptors for Patriot, AMRAAM missiles for their fighters, and some sniper targeting pods that, among other things, enable fighters to use cheaper, laser-guided counter-UAS munitions. So, yeah, as it were, in 2025, the Saudis received a monumental air and missile defense package, right in time for a major conflict that's been very demanding on their air and missile defense assets, to contrast to other planned deliveries to countries in the region that arguably came a bit late. It's been reported, for example, the Iranians entered into a deal with Moscow for the purchase of about 2,500 MANPADS missiles and 500 launchers. Given the sometimes low-level flying we've seen by American and Israeli jets over Iranian airspace, coupled with the extensive use of relatively vulnerable drones, you can imagine the Iranians probably would have liked to have an extra 500 launchers and 2,500 missiles that they could scatter around the country. The only issue, they were reportedly due for delivery between 2027 and 2029. As I said, these things usually come with a time delay. If we're talking about major time delays though, we have to mention India. Some of the coverage I've seen focuses on the fact that India continued to receive shipments from Russia in 2025, and this was sometimes represented as being a bit of a geopolitical signal. While I certainly think there are indicators we could look at in terms of the relationship between New Delhi and Moscow, the 2025 delivery list probably isn't it. Some of these deliveries related to orders from the 2000s, but almost all the major Russia deliveries here were from orders dating back to 2018 or 19. The core point here is a lot of the data we're looking at today is essentially backward-looking, and there are a lot of major developments, especially from 2025, that we're not going to see coming through yet. But, as well as giving us some interesting trends, there are a couple of things I think it can show us. One, arms transfers and arms orders signal political orientation. Who you're buying from or not buying from is often an extension of your broader geopolitical alignment. And especially when you're talking about complex, expensive, long service life systems, when you choose to buy from another country, you're essentially entering into a long-term relationship, one where divorce can potentially be drawn out, expensive, and extremely disruptive. Because if you choose to rely on a certain supplier, and then it turns out a couple of years down the track that they're not so friendly anymore, or perhaps not willing or able to supply you with the spares or sustainment services you need to keep that equipment running, then you potentially find yourself in a difficult situation, one where reliance can potentially be transformed into leverage. The other major clue it can give us is what capability level different countries might be targeting. These aren't collectible water bottles or fast fashion, they're generational commitments. And so if a country, for example, goes all in on the delivery of a 4th generation fighter with delivery stretching out into the 2040s, you might be at least moderately confident that until they're willing to make another transformational scale investment, you probably don't need to worry about them fielding a large 5th or 6th generation fleet. And so where we see countries committing heavily to a given platform type or technology now, that might give us some good clues about where their capabilities are likely to be circa 2030 or beyond. So, context around spending and a couple of caveats in place. Before we jump into individual countries, let's look at some major arms transfer trends that we saw in 2025. What I've presented on screen here is the average annual arms transfer amount, according to the SIPRI data, split into 5 time periods. We have the immediate pre-Crimea period, 2011 to 2013, post-Crimea, so 2016 to 2018, pre-full-scale invasion of Ukraine, 2019 to 2021, the post-invasion period, 2022 through 2024, and then to compare against the rest, the data from 2025. What that shows is that the 2019 through 21 period was actually kind of chill in terms of global transfers, but 2022 to 2024 ramped up above the levels we were previously seeing, and 2025 kicked it upwards again. Interestingly, across those time periods, what makes up the selection of systems being transferred in terms of total value has mostly remained broadly consistent. Here I've split transfers in those periods up into the categories aircraft, missiles, ships and naval weapons, armoured vehicles and artillery, air defence systems and other, and for the most part you won't see a huge amount of movement. Ships and naval weapons were 14% of transfers in 2011 to 2013 and 14% in 2025. Some categories will occasionally be a bit lumpy, as a few major transfers can skew things in any given year, but the big data standout in 2025 was the expansion of the air defence and missile category. In 2011 to 13, that made up a total 17% of transfers, 5% the air defence systems themselves, 12% missiles of various kinds, including interceptors. 2019 to 21, immediately before the Russian invasion, once again, 17%. 3% air defence systems, 14% missiles. Cut to 2025 though, and that figure is now 27%, 10% air defence systems and 17% missiles. Now, that's partly skewed by a couple of very large deliveries that we'll go over through this episode, but there are also reasons for strong air defence demand. At the risk of oversimplifying, a lot of major arms buyers are going to have potential opponents that fall into at least one of two categories. You have competitors with strong missile or drone arsenals, in which case you probably want a good air and missile defence system if you can afford it, and or you're looking at competitors with a strong air force, in which case, once again, you might want a good air and missile defence system. These defensive capabilities can also be politically attractive, even if they're not always the most militarily efficient solution. As we've seen in many cases, from Ukraine to the Middle East, relying on relatively expensive air defence systems like Patriot to counter opposing ballistic missiles is a great recipe to spend an asymmetric amount of money quickly. But a focus on defensive capabilities can also give political leaders more of a viable option to stand mostly on the defensive, which might potentially be very politically and strategically attractive, even if it's not strictly militarily efficient. If the UAE had gone all in on offensive capabilities instead of defensive ones, for example, they might have essentially been forced to either go on the offensive against Iranian targets or concede, because the amount of damage being done by Iranian attacks, and which could potentially be done by future attacks, would be so much greater. So if you have a capability that's valued in a lot of places, that gives politicians desirable options, that's also very expensive, perhaps it's not surprising that it's now making up a larger share of global transfers. As for where we might expect that trend to go in the coming years, though, we'll come back to in a future episode. But to start digging into all of this in a little bit more detail, I think we need to come at it from two directions. Compared to previous years, if we look at 2025, who was doing the buying and who was doing the selling? What I've got there on the right there is essentially an arms imports leaderboard, comparing the years right before the Russian invasion, 2020 to 2021, and the most recent years of the new normal, at least for now, 2024-2025. Despite the world-changing events that happened in between, a lot of nations remained relatively consistent in both their volumes and position. There were some changes down the lower end of the list. The People's Republic of China basically dropped off the board as an arms importer, for example. Ukraine quite understandably jumped to position 1, shifting India down to 2nd, while Saudi Arabia fell from 2nd to 3rd despite receiving more deliveries in total, and Poland rocketed up the charts from essentially an afterthought to 4th. Some of those changes reflect the broader regional trends that we've observed since 2022. Europe has gone from being very secondary in terms of arms transfers compared to the likes of Asia and the Middle East, to, taken together, being a larger market than either one of them. Given recent events, though, I suspect that green Middle East section of the bar might be changing shape a little in the coming years. If we hone in on 2025 specifically, though, there's a couple of interesting things we can say about that top 3. For example, it's relatively intuitive that being in the middle of a conventional war, Ukraine would be at the top of the list for 2024-2025. But the split in arms received is absolutely not even between the 2 years. This is a chart showing SIPRI tracked arms deliveries to Ukraine 2021 through 2025. As you can see, between 2022 and 2024, there was a pretty clear and consistent upward trend. Around 3,000 TIV in 22, more than 4,000 in 2023, and north of 5,000 in 2024. In 2025, though, the tracked deliveries dropped back down below 2022 levels, with a contraction in the volume being received from European states and an absolute collapse in US deliveries. Now, given what we know about the increases in military assistance funding from Europe to Ukraine that took place in 2025, that might initially look a bit odd, but stick with me, there's a couple of things probably going on here. On the US side, it's pretty simple. There was a changeover in administration in the White House, and with that change came an end to any further US military aid packages. Now, what we're seeing delivered generally falls into one of two categories. Assistance or deliveries that were agreed or contracted before 2025 that are now being delivered and will continue to be delivered for some years, or US weapon systems that are being purchased mostly by the European allies and are being supplied to Ukraine through the PURL program. The other thing that's changed, especially affecting those European figures, is what Ukraine is actually being supplied with. Early on, a lot of the initial aid push was to gather up a whole bunch of Warsaw Pact hardware that was sitting around European warehouses and then make sure it got lost on the Ukrainian side of the border as quickly as possible. If you look at shipments to Ukraine by category by year, you'll see that manifest in that large percentage of armour and artillery. All those T-72s, BMPs and Soviet-era self-propelled guns, and later the Leopards, the Bradleys and the Abrams, all fall into that green part of the bar. Recently, though, a lot more of the assistance is things like sustainment and artillery ammunition, which isn't counted by SIPRI. Or it specifically takes the form of things like aircraft that Ukraine isn't in a position to manufacture itself. Because what's now happening to a great extent, especially when you talk about things like drones or artillery, is that European military assistance is taking the form of funding to Ukraine to produce weapons in Ukraine. That so-called Danish model can be very popular because, among other things, it tends to be quite cost-effective. Good luck finding a European or American 155mm artillery system, for example, that's priced as cheaply as the Ukrainian ones. But as far as SIPRI is concerned, that's not an arms transfer. The equipment begins and likely ends its operational lifetime in Ukraine. So as far as the data is concerned, if you're funding two S-22s instead of shipping Caesars, that shows a significant drop-off in the SIPRI database. A lot of what's likely to remain is the stuff where Ukraine doesn't have a real viable domestic alternative. With funding, Ukraine can make its own artillery, but it can't produce Patriots or SAM-T interceptors for shooting down Russian ballistic missiles. It can produce lots of small things that fly, like one-way attack drones, but not larger things that fly, like F-16s. That means that while the numbers drop, as long as assistance from Europe continues, we shouldn't expect to see them go to zero. Although I do think there's an open question over just how much of an arms exporter Ukraine is likely to be if the conflict ever winds down to a point where it doesn't need all of its output for itself. We've already seen that start to happen with interceptor drones, but I think it's generally accepted that there might be some potential in other systems categories as well. With the combination of something being generally cheaper, battle-proven, and already being turned out by a hot production line, potentially being an attractive proposition for some countries in a hurry to get access to hardware they can be pretty confident works. Next up, and fairly consistent on the podium, we have India, a country which has longer-term ambitions to produce more and more of its own defence material, but in the short to medium term isn't quite there yet, and is still highly reliant either on imports or licensing agreements from across the global market. 2025 actually saw a significant uptick in arms shipments to India over 2023 or 2024 levels. At just shy of 3,000 TIV, it was slightly higher than levels were in 2022, but lower than what we saw in 2021, a year where there were some major deliveries. In terms of where those imports are coming from, India is one of those countries with more diverse buying habits. In recent years, the country's had four main suppliers: Russia, France, Israel, to a lesser extent the United States, while there's also pretty consistent smaller-scale business with other countries in Europe. One thing you'll probably notice when the chart is expressed like this is that in 2024 and 2025, India actually received a greater percentage of its arms imports from Russia than it did back in 2021. That might look like a geopolitical statement, but it's really more a function of what long-term orders get delivered when. The basic gist here is that India's strategy continues to rely on diversified arms imports. They're not beholden to any single supplier for everything, and even within some equipment categories, you'll often find multiple suppliers in play. This is a force, for example, that flies both Sukhois and Rafales. It operates Russian lineage tanks supported by American lineage helicopters, with indirect fire provided by Korean-designed artillery, covered by air defense systems that might have some Israeli or Russian DNA. That's a key thing to remember about the SIPRI transfer data. It's not always about arms being manufactured in one country and then delivered to another. It also picks up things like licensed local production that have often been a significant part of the Indian procurement model. with India often pushing for a transfer of know-how and technology from multiple different arms providers, continually trying to assimilate more Russian, French, or Israeli expertise into the Indian defence industrial base. That willingness to diversify also means that India can pitch different countries against each other when it comes to bidding, meaning you can expect they'll make more than a few appearances in the Future Focused episode, with some of the most hard-fought international procurement competitions being underpinned by the Indian budget. By comparison, in recent years, Saudi Arabia's imports have been roughly equivalent to India's, but the selection process generally seems to be much simpler. If you're Riyadh, you take a wide look around the world at all the potential arms suppliers out there, and then you buy the most advanced American option that Washington's willing to sell you. One thing that isn't always factored into analysis of the current war in the Middle East is just how much, over the course of several decades, the GCC countries have spent on imported weapon systems, to the point where in 2025, the Saudis actually received more tracked weapons deliveries than Ukraine did, which I think helps put in perspective some of what the Iranian missile and drone force has been able to achieve, and why it may not have been able to achieve more. For the Saudis, 2025 was a bit of a bumper year for deliveries, but as I mentioned earlier, that's really dominated by just one set of items, namely THAAD and the Talon interceptors to fire from it. Hence the significant increase in the light green chunk of the bar that you see in 2025, as well as the growth in that orange missile component. Without preempting the future too much, though, this is where current events start to intrude a bit, because as it was, while 2025 was a massive year of deliveries to Riyadh, it was actually very quiet when it came to publicly tracked new orders. SIPRI only tracked a few, of which 2 weren't even for the United States. They were for anti-submarine aircraft and torpedoes from Italy. That suggests there might have been a slight demand lull from one of the main foreign purchasers of American weapons. But I think it's fair to say, given recent events, the demand picture in 2026 might end up looking a bit different, which gets us from the buyers over to the sellers. And since we don't have time to look at every country out there on the market, I thought we'd instead look at 1 or 2 examples from 3 categories: the year's losers, the year's winners, and those where it's really just a bit of a mixed bag. First up, and arguably unsurprisingly picking up the wooden spoon several years running, we have former arms export giant, the Russian Federation. Now, the obvious point to make here is that a reduction in Russian arms exports doesn't mean the country is producing fewer weapons. Far from it. It's just that at the moment, a lot of that product is needed by the Russian military itself, while a lot of traditional buyers have become geopolitically very cautious about trying to buy weapon systems from a state that might either delay them, send them to Ukraine, and/or fall afoul of international sanctions in the process. That said, it's still an important metric to track, because historically, a lot of the financial approach in the Russian defence sector was to use profitable foreign export contracts to essentially cross-subsidise low-profit or loss-making contracts signed with the Russian MOD. With interest rates in Russia very high, losing that external revenue hurts for the sector. And it's certainly not the case that Russian firms haven't continued to turn up to international arms expos to try and sell their products. It's just that, for the most part, they haven't been having a tremendous amount of success. Russia's tracked exports deliveries in 2025 were very slightly down from 2024, but up from 2023 levels. At about 1,900 TOV, they were less than a quarter of what Russia managed in some of the last pre-Crimea years, about 8,700 in 2011 or 8,300 in 2012. And in percentage terms, the impact is actually even more stark, because Russia's exports have been shrinking at the same time the global market has been growing. In that pre-Crimea period, 2011 to 2013, Russia accounted for about 29% of global tracked deliveries. In 2019 to 2021, right before the full-scale invasion, it was closer to 15%. 2022 to 2024 brought that figure down to around 7%, and in 2025, south of 6%. And even most of that percentage was still held up by agreements made well before the 2022 invasion. Looking at the 2025 order book, things were arguably pretty dire for the Russian sector. Only 3 countries appear in the SIPRI data: India, Mali, and Uganda, with the latter 2 not being particularly cashed-up buyers compared to the likes of India. I also suspect we might see Iran and Algeria later added to that data when it's revised, but we'll see. It's even technically possible that Russia may have become a net importer of weapon systems and munitions rather than a net exporter, with South Korean estimates being that the country received somewhere between 7.7 and 14.4 billion US dollars worth of military equipment and munitions from North Korea between 2023 and December 2025. Now, of course, in the short term, that by itself doesn't mean much, and it's certainly no comfort to the Ukrainians who have to deal with the bulk of Russia's military industrial output being directed straight at them, along with the likes of imported ballistic missiles and artillery shells from North Korea. But from a longer-term perspective, the longer this goes, the more the long-term risks for the Russian arms sector might be accruing. You arguably have a bit of a reputation issue, with some of Russia's major exports, like its air defence systems, arguably facing more than a bit of mixed coverage in the media. India, for example, was reportedly reasonably happy with the performance of its S-400s in its recent engagements with Pakistan, but Russian air defence systems more generally haven't exactly won enormous praise for their performance in Venezuela, Iran, or in the face of Ukraine's drone and missile campaign. Now, where that narrative and reporting sits on the spectrum from unfair to understating the problem is a whole different question, but in some ways, mostly besides the point. For a lot of countries, reputation can be a significant factor in arms purchase decisions, and some of Russia's traditionally most valuable exports haven't been universally covering themselves in glory. There's also the geopolitical factors, which are kind of obvious, and then an element which is somewhat less so, which is how the Russian defence industry has had to adapt itself to meet wartime rather than primarily export demand. For the most part, what Russia has needed to fight the war in Ukraine is reliable weapon systems that it can procure affordably, in large numbers, and shovel into the fire as quickly as possible. That's meant a lot of expensive next-generation weapon system programs, everything from the T-14 Armata to the Sukhoi 75 to the Okhotnik UCAV, have been de-emphasised. Armata has been basically shelved, officially because it costs too much compared to the likes of T-90. The Russian aviation sector has been flushed with additional funding, but a lot of that's going into the production of things like Sukhoi 34 and Tu-160, and to a lesser extent Sukhoi 57, rather than focusing on pushing the technological boundary faster and further. The reason that matters is that going forward, a lot of the more cashed-up buyers on the international market aren't going to want to purchase previous generation technology. And if competitors from, for example, Europe or Asia are able to go to the market while Russia is distracted and offer products that push the technological boundaries while having the capacity to produce them, it's possible that by the time Russian firms are able to turn their attention back to the international market, their product offering just isn't good enough. Now, to be fair, there are still areas where Russia has products that might be able to make international sales with significant value, and where there might be potential for things to ramp up, especially if the war ever winds down. The Sukhoi 57 is not an F-35 or a J-20, but it is potentially an expensive platform that might get some international takers. We've had our first visual evidence of Algeria taking its first deliveries, and it's possible there may be more where that came from. Likewise, if Russia ever stopped firing them against Ukraine, I can imagine there might be some international demand for systems like Iskander, proven to be dangerous and effective on the Ukrainian battlefield, while being produced in larger numbers by Russian industry now than before the invasion began. But, as with so many other Russian products, the same caveats apply. Post-war opportunities require a post-war period. And with 2026 seeing the invasion cross into its fifth year, Russia has now left a major gulf in the international arms market for more than 48 months, with it likely becoming harder to ever reclaim that territory with every additional month or year that passes. Based on the data available, I think another underperforming award, alongside Russia, has to go to the People's Republic of China at least in 2025. Not so much because of what we've seen happen to those exports, but what we haven't. As we've covered before on the channel, my general assessment is that a lot of Chinese military hardware now is in many categories going to be competitive with or outright superior to what's being offered by the Russian Federation. Some Chinese weapon systems even got a bit of an international reputation win in 2025 with the engagements between India and Pakistan. There, the combination of Chinese-built J-10 fighters and PL-15E missiles, coupled with Pakistan's Swedish AWACS, appears to have proven itself quite dangerous against the Indian Air Force. So, you have a country with a lot of industrial capacity, turning out weapon systems that in many cases have Russian or Soviet design heritage, solid on-paper performance characteristics, and probably in at least some cases a competitive price point. If that was all the information and context you had, you might conclude there was an opportunity here for China to essentially eat Russia's lunch. Try and take over at least parts of the arms market that Russia necessarily had to abandon as it redirected production for its own domestic needs. For the most part, though, unlike so many other industrial sectors, we haven't really seen that happen. And in fact, Chinese tracked arms exports in 2025 were actually down in absolute TIV terms compared to all of those other periods we look at. Of the 15 years, from 2010 to 2025 inclusive, 2025 was the second slowest year on record for Chinese exports, ahead only of 2020. To put that in percentage terms, in 2025, Beijing captured about 2.6% of the market, roughly half of the 5.6% we've seen for the entire 2010 to 2025 period. Now, as I warned before and will keep warning, looking at any individual year is a fraught exercise when it comes to multi-year contracts and arms exports. A few major deliveries here or there can really throw the numbers out, and so they do tend to be a bit bumpy. But even with that caveat in place, there are still a few areas where Chinese exports look much weaker than you might expect for the world's foremost manufacturing power. For one, the customer base is still incredibly concentrated. As you can see across these time periods, at any point, at minimum, a majority of Chinese exports went to one of three countries: Pakistan, Bangladesh, or Myanmar. And given the discrepancy in financial capacity between those states, unsurprisingly, it was usually Pakistan taking the lion's share. To the point where if it wasn't for Pakistan, in 2025, China wouldn't just be behind the likes of France and Italy, they would have fallen short of the Netherlands and Sweden. In terms of broadening that base, from Beijing's perspective, we've seen some promising developments and some more negative ones. On the plus side, Serbia has now provided China with its foothold into the European weapons market, with Vucic confirming that his country has added a number of Chinese weapon systems to its arsenal, while other cases of the delivery clientele expanding included particularly air defence system deliveries to countries like Azerbaijan and Tajikistan. A theme here is if you're the kind of country that might want a Russian-style air defence system, but for reasons practical or political would rather get it from Beijing than Moscow, then you might, for example, end up in the market for HQ-17 instead of Tor, or in Azerbaijan's case, HQ-9 instead of S-300. On the flip side, it now seems unlikely that at least one historical purchaser of Chinese weapon systems, Venezuela, is likely to be swinging round to make any repeat purchases. Now, in the long run, I'd argue that in many respects, the Chinese still have the wind at their back. They increasingly have modern offerings across multiple product categories, including some of the ones where you tend to see very high-value contracts. Think fifth-generation fighters or air and missile defense systems. Some of those might be a recipe for high-profile, high-value future sales. But this video is focused on 2025, not the future. And as of 2025, China hasn't really seized much of the market share left open by the Russians, with a significant part of that potentially just being down to straight geopolitics, where some of the major historical buyers of Russian weapon systems, cough India cough, might not be in a hurry to instead buy jets and missiles from a country its military routinely war plans against. As for what the future holds, though, for Chinese export potential, time will tell. Moving on, before we get into some of the states that saw a distinct uptick, I want to briefly talk about the United States. Because if you're doing a video on arms exports, it'd be kind of a weird move to skip the country that controls about 40% of the market in recent years. But the reality is, data doesn't always tell interesting stories. And for the US, 2025 was, statistically speaking, a bit of a nothing burger. Total deliveries almost barely moved, up about 2.4% in total, with two massive swings in demand essentially cancelling each other out. Shipments to Ukraine fell by just over 2,000 TIV, from 2,778 in 2024 to 582 in 2025, only for deliveries to Saudi Arabia to jump by, you guessed it, about 2,000 TIV. That's not to say I don't think there are some enormous and consequential stories for US arms exports coming up. There are. There are some massive competitions where US systems are one of the competitors. There's a coming standoff with the Europeans about the prospect of Buy European making its way into European procurement processes, and there is an enormous amount to say about what the war in the Middle East might mean for the US sector going forward. But in 2025, the picture was in some ways a reversion to the mean. A massive reduction in shipments to a relatively new recipient, Ukraine, and a surge in volumes to a long-term customer in Riyadh. So, if it wasn't the United States capturing these increased volumes from all the additional global sales and the Russian retreat from the market, who was it? The answer is a lot of different countries tried their hand, but I think in the interest of time, there are just four that deserve a specific mention, starting with two of the main European exporters, Italy and France. There's a couple of reasons to look at these countries together. There are a number of product categories, for example, where the two often cooperate, with the SAMP-T air defence system and the FREMM frigate being two of the most famous examples. They also both had good years in 2025 compared to their 15-year averages, and in 2025, they both came very, very close to hitting a historical milestone. As you can see from this chart here, in absolute terms, export from both countries in 2025 was up considerably from where they were either pre or immediately post-Crimea. Although in France's case, they were much closer to where they were in 2019-2021, whereas Italy saw more significant growth over that period of time. Whereas over the last 15 years, the two countries have made up an average of about 13% of global exports. In 2025, it was close to 16%. And so far as that major milestone goes, it comes back to how far the mighty have fallen in Moscow. In the years leading up to Crimea, France was exporting about a fifth what the Russians were. The Italians, as you can see, significantly less than that. In the post-invasion period, though, we saw Paris overtake Moscow. And in 2025, Italy came within a statistical hair's breadth of doing the same, with Italian exports of 1,923 TIV falling short of Russia's at 1,941. At which point, you wonder if the Italians couldn't have just given the Ukrainians a couple of extra armoured vehicles for free in order to take the win, but in the end, the numbers are the numbers. As we look at some of these major winners, though, outside heavy hitters like the United States, or formerly the Russian Federation, there's a theme I'm going to come back to again and again. While they're winning, they're usually not winning in every category. Often, they're going to be specialised and focused. For the French, mostly things like ships, submarines, and fighter jets, while for the Italians, very distinctly, ships, fighter jets, and helicopters instead of submarines. For France, the Rafale, various frigates, and of course various submarine deals have pretty consistently run up the numbers in recent years. Whereas in 2025, the Italians mostly ran up the score with two major deliveries. Italian-built Eurofighters to Kuwait, again just in time for recent events, and the delivery of two Brawijaya-class ships to Indonesia. I mention them not just because they're important to the numbers, but also because they represent an interesting way a country can temporarily push up its export figures. The ship, which is currently the KRI Brawijaya, was actually originally ordered under a very different name for the Italian Navy. The Italians sold two of them to the Indonesian Navy in 2024 for 1.2 billion euros. So yeah, if you want to rack up a bunch of export dollars quickly and offer rapid delivery timelines, just selling ships originally intended for your Navy is always apparently an option. Moving on to another country that saw a significant uptick in volumes in 2025, and one which is more than a little relevant in light of recent events, let's talk about Israel. Far more than, for example, Beijing, it's Israel that we've seen taking a greater share of the arms market since 2022. Total exports had already jumped considerably in 2022 through 2024 compared to pre-invasion levels, and as you can see, 2025 was a significant jump again. In 2025, Israel delivered about 2,600 tracked TIV, roughly 8% of the global market, compared to a 15-year average of 3.3%. But I think here, even more than in other cases, there's a danger in reading too much into a single-year figure, because the underlying story here and the associated risks are a bit more complicated than just line go up. Like many smaller producers across the market, Israel isn't strong across the board, they've specialised. They're not really a major factor in some of the largest international categories, think aircraft or ships. Instead, over the last 15 years, about 75% of Israeli arms exports fell into just one of three categories: missiles, sensors, and air defence systems. In 2025, as you can see here, that number was closer to 90%. And when you have a comparatively smaller supplier focused on a smaller wedge of the market, just a few major contracts one way or the other can cause wild swings in the figures. For example, in 2025, the single largest arms transfer from Israel, tracked by SIPRI, is the one you can see described on the right there, the transfer of the Arrow 3 system to Germany. For Germany, and by extension Europe, this was a major milestone. This was meant to be the new highest tier of the European Sky Shield air and missile defence system, and made Germany the first European nation with access to an exo-atmospheric interceptor capable of shooting down high-level ballistic threats without relying on the United States, be that SM-3 fired from US Navy ships, or the Aegis Ashore system based in places like Romania. If Russia were to fire something like Oreshnik against targets in Central Europe, this would probably be the most likely candidate, at least for now, to try and make an intercept. So by European standards, Arrow 3 is fairly unique. It's fairly capable, and it's fairly expensive. What you can see on screen here are Israeli arm transfers tracked by year, with the orange bar being the Arrow 3 transfer to Germany, and the blue bars being literally everything else. As you can see, if you remove just that one contract, suddenly 2025 would go from being a bumper year to pretty in line with the post-2022 norm. And why that matters is because it's all potentially very fragile and uncertain. Because many of those air defence products in particular, where the Israelis are most competitive on the international market, are also often the kinds of systems and munitions where there's a lot of demand from the IDF. Of all the Israeli interceptor tiers that have been tested by Iranian missile attack in 2025 and 2026, all the way from the Tamir interceptors for Iron Dome up through David Sling to Arrow, it's anecdotally that top tier where the depletion pressure has been the most acute, to the point where we saw the US step in with some of its own systems, like THAAD and SM-3. In short, this is a high-demand system, which makes for at least 2 points to watch going forward. Whether the geopolitics of purchasing Israeli weapons shift in some countries as a result of more recent events, and also in cases where production capacity is an immediate constraint, how delivery priority is divided between new potential export customers and the Israeli military itself. In the current global environment, you can expect that a lot of potential customers are going to want their systems and interceptors yesterday. At the same time, some are probably going to be looking at the IDF's interceptor magazines and hoping they go to the front of the queue. So whether the Israelis are able to move fast enough to capitalise on global demand, I think remains to be seen. Which brings us to the final country I wanted to mention today, which has proven time and time again that they're willing to pull out pretty much all the stops in order to hit some very ambitious timelines. For a country that 15 years ago was a relative afterthought when it came to international exports, the Republic of Korea has seen a very rapid rise. SIPRI tracked deliveries in 2025 were about 3 times the 2022 through 2024 average, and close to 7 times the annual average from the immediate pre-Crimea period. 2025 was also the first time, according to the SIPRI data, where tracked South Korean arms deliveries exceeded those of Russia, with the figure of 2,020 TIV, putting them ahead of Russia, but behind Israel. Since 2022, a lot of those deliveries have been driven by demand from one main country, Poland, with the ROK basically becoming the country's second supplier, alongside the United States. There are, however, a couple of things that make Korea interesting from an arms export perspective, beyond just these raw figures. For one, while just a small number of countries still account for a majority of purchases here, the overall customer bench, if you like, for Korean weapons is actually relatively broad. Between 2022 and 2025, SIPRI recorded South Korean arms transfers to about 20 recipient countries, with major customers outside Poland, including the likes of the Philippines and United Arab Emirates. The Koreans are also interesting because of just how many different equipment categories they're choosing to compete in. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of smaller suppliers mostly focus on a couple of areas of specialisation: missiles, air defence systems and sensors for the Israelis, maritime and aviation for the French. You get the idea. South Korean firms, though, have been marketing fairly broadly. Whether you're talking about armour and artillery, missiles and air defence systems, ships, submarines or combat aircraft, you'll often see at least one Korean product trying to compete for the niche. Those products also sometimes represent a degree of technological hybridization, if you will. The Chongung-2 air defence system, for example, which competes in that medium-range surface-to-air / anti-ballistic missile system category, technologically speaking, has a bit of Russian DNA. There are still clearly some glaring technological gaps. The ROK has a fighter aircraft available to the export market, for example, the KF-21, but for the moment, that still relies on licence-built American engines, which is a more limiting scenario than might be faced like powers like France or the People's Republic of China, who are capable of offering aircraft powered by their own designs. But still, I think it's notable how quickly some of those technological gaps have been closed. There are also 2 elements of South Korea's sales strategy that I think deserve noting. The first is that on a number of occasions, the South Korean government has been willing to take a backseat on its own deliveries or even pull stuff out of its own inventory in order to divert supply to potential export customers faster, in order to win or maintain business. It's reported that one of the reasons the Poles were able to get their K2 tanks relatively quickly is because Seoul was willing to divert production capacity to make it happen. More recently, it's claimed the Koreans may have pulled about 30 interceptor missiles for the Chongung-2 out of their own inventory in order to help top up the UAE, who are burning through interceptors dealing with Iranian ballistic missiles. The main reason I bring this up is to provide the contrast with countries like Russia. Whereas you'd expect Moscow to usually have to put its domestic requirements first, and then try to sustain its international market position with whatever capacity remains available, the Koreans have more freedom to take small short-term readiness risks in order to try and maximise their market share. Although notably, despite being willing to resupply countries like the UAE in the middle of a regional war, Seoul notably continued to shy away from supplying the Ukrainians in the midst of their own war, even after large quantities of North Korean munitions started ending up in Russian service. So while a lot of countries might see Korean supplies as an open alternative to some other traditional suppliers, it's important to remember that Seoul's export policy is very much not a completely open door. A final observation is we've seen Korean firms almost adopt a kind of customer bridgehead strategy, where you try and sign major agreements that might include local production and tech transfer with a major purchaser in a region, and then use that experience and infrastructure as a base to try and market out beyond that. In Europe, the main bridgehead and site for production localization is obviously Poland. In Africa, Egypt became a major customer. In the Middle East, the United Arab Emirates. And following on from the sales of air defence systems to the Emirates, we also saw multi-billion-dollar agreements struck with Saudi Arabia and Iraq. That latter sale to Iraq is potentially interesting from a strategic perspective. By the standards of the region, Iraq's air defence capabilities have long been comparatively limited. The country's American F-16s, for example, were notably not supplied with AMRAAMs, but instead older versions of the AIM-9 and the old AIM-7 Sparrow. Add 10 batteries of relatively modern surface-to-air missile systems into the equation, however, and Baghdad might suddenly have a lot more options, if it wants to tell any of its neighbours, to get off its airspace lawn. And as we'll cover in the future, there's also currently a high-stakes bidding war, which is pitting Korean submarines against German U-boats for a massive Canadian contract. The point is, in terms of raw deliveries, South Korea may still be a long way between some traditional suppliers, like, for example, France. But the overall export strategy looks extremely ambitious. And at a time where demand is high and a lot of traditional suppliers are pretty backlogged, I think it'll be interesting to see whether Seoul is able to take more market ground in the coming years. That, though, is starting to pivot into questions of what comes next. I think a fair summary then is that 2025 represented a flow-through of some of the pressures we saw emerge in 2022 through 2024, from rapid 2022 orders translating into 2025 deliveries, to a fall-off in supplies to Ukraine, reflecting the change in politics in Washington. If we're looking forward to 2026 or 2027, though, it's hard to argue the deck hasn't been shuffled again. From wars in the Middle East to transatlantic tensions, the geopolitical landscape just looks very different now than it did back in 2022 or 2023, when many of the decisions that shaped the 2025 arms market were being made. Unless something dramatic changes, there are some trends we can expect to continue. It would be very, very difficult, for example, for Russia to try and fully revive its market position while still fighting a war. And the global security climate being what it is, I can't imagine the big global surface-to-air missile producers are going to be going out of business anytime soon. But beyond that, a lot of the big decisions and trends are still up in the air, and we'll start to unpack just some of those next episode. And alright, brief channel update to close out. For me, as I'm sure with all of you, the release of the SIPRI data every year is a bit of a fixture on my calendar, and while it's obviously not possible to pull apart all of it in an episode or two every year, I do hope you found the bits I chose to focus on interesting. As I said near the start, the plan is to cover this over the course of 2 episodes, and while I might normally split those up over a longer period of time, given I'm going in for hopefully a quick and easy surgery this week, from a video production perspective, it just made more sense to produce the 2 of them in parallel. With any luck, part 2 should be releasing at its normal time on the coming Sunday, and if there is any change to that schedule, I'll be sure to let you know. Likewise, Perun Gaming people, things might be a bit quiet for the coming week, but then hopefully beyond that, I should be able to get some content flowing again. As always, thank you very much to all of you for your ongoing engagement and support. Hope you enjoyed the episode, and with any luck, I'll see you all again next week.